The silence in the middle of nowhere was suffocating. I'd been driving for hours, the sun long set, the road ahead lit only by the faint beams from my headlights. My car hummed steadily, and the tires on the cracked asphalt made a constant sound. It was the only thing breaking the eerie quiet of the vast, empty countryside. Around me, nothing but fields stretched in every direction. No signs of life, no houses, no lights. It felt like I was the last person on Earth. I hadn't planned on being out here. The road I was on wasn't even on my map. I was just trying to get back home after visiting a friend, and somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn, and here I was. There had been no towns, no exits, just miles of nothing. I wasn't scared. I mean, not exactly. I was a little unsettled, sure, but more out of frustration than fear. The thought of having to find a place to turn around and retrace my steps didn't sit well with me. But I kept going. The GPS on my phone was dead. No surprise there. I hadn't seen a signal for miles, and I didn't even know which direction I was going anymore. The radio was filled with static. No one was out here. No one at all. It wasn't like I hadn't been on back roads before, but this felt different, more isolating. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the task at hand. Just keep driving, just get out of this place. Then I saw the lights. They were small at first, just a faint flicker ahead, probably a house in the distance. I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe there was someone out here, someone to ask for directions. Maybe I could even stretch my legs and get a bit of a break from the monotonous drive. As I neared, the lights didn't get any brighter. They didn't seem like the kind of lights you would see coming from a house or a gas station. Instead, they were dim and odd, faint, yellowish glows that seemed to flicker and pulse unnaturally. I slowed the car down as I got closer, instinct telling me to be cautious. The road up ahead was no longer a smooth stretch of blacktop, but a rough, gravel path that looked like it had seen better days. The flickering lights were coming from some kind of shack or small building off the side of the road. There was no sign indicating it was a business or a home, just a decrepit structure, barely visible through the fog that had begun to roll in. The building itself was old, the wood dark and cracked, and I could barely make out the outline of what looked like an old pickup truck parked nearby. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't just keep driving without checking. So, I pulled off the road and parked by the edge of the gravel path, shutting off my engine. The hum of the car died down immediately, leaving the world even quieter. I could hear the distant rustling of the wind and, in the background, what I swore was the faintest sound of someone, moving inside the shack. I hesitated for a moment, sitting there in the car with my hand still on the door handle. I could leave. It was probably safer to just keep going until I found a real town. But curiosity gnawed at me. Something told me that if I didn't at least see what was going on, I might regret it later. So, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. As I moved closer, I could hear the creaking of the wooden structure and the sound of someone humming. A low, eerie tune that seemed to echo in the cold air. It was a man's voice, but it didn't sound human in the way I expected. It was like someone trying to remember how to hum, but failing miserably. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed through. The door to the shack was ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light escape from the inside. I stopped just before the threshold and called out, "Hello!" My voice cracked in the stillness. No response, just the humming. I pushed the door open slightly more and peered inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a mix of something rotting and a faint scent of metal, like old rusted tools. My stomach churned, and I stepped back, trying not to breathe too deeply. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a man sitting at a small, rickety table in the center of the room. His back was to me, but I could see him clearly now. He was hunched over, his hands moving as if he was working on something, though I couldn't tell what. His clothes were torn and tattered, and his hair, long and greasy, hung down over his face. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't even move, but he kept humming that strange, off-key melody, louder now, like he didn't care I was standing there. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct told me to leave, but I had to know what he was doing. Why was he here in the middle of nowhere in a shack like this? I stepped forward, and the floorboard creaked loudly under my foot. That's when he stopped humming. I froze. The silence that followed was worse than anything. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Slowly, the man turned his head toward me, but he didn't stand. He just looked over his shoulder with eyes that seemed too wide, too intense. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were frozen in time. His gaze was unsettling, almost too calm for someone who looked like they hadn't seen another soul in years. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat, without emotion. I shook my head, feeling the tight knot in my throat. "I'm just lost. I need directions." The man didn't respond. Instead, he stood up slowly and walked toward a table cluttered with all sorts of strange, discarded objects. Old papers, empty cans, and what looked like broken electronics. He muttered something under his breath, though it didn't sound like words, just sounds. Then he stopped at the edge of the table, picked something up, and turned back to face me. It was a knife, a long, sharp-looking knife, and his hand gripped it too tightly, like he was about to do something with it. I immediately took a step back. My mind raced as I thought about what to do. Something was wrong here. This man wasn't right. The fear I'd been suppressing hit me all at once. I turned to leave, but the man stepped toward me, blocking the door. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice colder now. I didn't answer, couldn't. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how much danger I was in. The door was the only way out, but it was blocked. The man kept staring at me, his eyes like two dark holes in his face. There was something about him, something off, like he wasn't quite human anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it deep in my gut. I turned on my heel and ran for the window at the back of the shack, the glass rattling as I shoved it open. The cold night air hit me in the face, and I jumped out onto the ground, scrambling to my feet as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard the sound of the man's boots hitting the floor, but I didn't stop. I ran as hard as I could, not daring to look back. It felt like forever before I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, finally managing to unlock the door. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled out of there, my heart still racing. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shack disappear into the distance, swallowed up by the darkness. I didn't look back. I was halfway through my cross-country road trip when I found myself on an isolated stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched ahead endlessly, flanked by nothing but flat, barren land as far as the eye could see. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, but the beauty of it was lost on me. I was running low on gas, and there hadn't been a service station or a single sign of civilization for miles. My phone had no signal, and I was beginning to feel the creeping unease that comes with being utterly alone. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier when I had the chance. The last town I passed through was hours ago, a blink-and-you'll-miss-it place with a single diner and a gas pump that looked like it hadn't been used since the 60s. I had waved it off, confident that I'd find a bigger station up ahead. Now, I was regretting that decision with every mile I drove. The car's gas gauge dipped into the red zone, and I knew I couldn't keep going much longer. I scanned the horizon for any sign of life, but all I saw was the endless, empty expanse of dirt and scrub. The road was eerily quiet. I hadn't seen another car in hours. It was as if I was the only person left in the world. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, plunging the landscape into darkness, I spotted something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of my desperate mind, but as I got closer, I saw it was a building. It looked like an old gas station, its faded sign barely legible in the dim light. Relief flooded through me, and I pulled in, my tires crunching on the gravel. The place was a relic from another era, with peeling paint and a single rusty pump. A flickering neon light buzzed above the door, casting an eerie glow over the entrance. The windows were dark, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. The only sound was the ticking of my car's cooling engine. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The stillness was unnerving. The station was surrounded by nothing but open land, and the vastness of it made me feel exposed. I walked to the door and pushed it open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the empty space. Inside, the place was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The shelves were mostly empty, lined with dusty cans and faded boxes of snacks. A counter stood at the far end, with an old cash register and a bell that looked like it hadn't been rung in years. There was no sign of anyone. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer. I rang the bell, the sharp ding making me flinch. Still nothing. I looked around, feeling a growing sense of unease. There was a door behind the counter, slightly ajar, leading to what I assumed was a back room. I hesitated. Something about this place didn't feel right, but I didn't have much choice. I needed gas, and this was my only option. I walked back outside to check the pump. It was one of those old, manual ones with a crank. There was no card reader, just a faded sign that said, "Pay inside." I tried the nozzle, but nothing happened. The pump was dry. Frustration bubbled up inside me, and I slammed the nozzle back into its holder. Now what? As I stood there, trying to figure out my next move, I heard a noise. It was faint, barely audible over the silence, but it was there. A soft shuffling sound, like someone moving around inside the station. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe there was someone here after all. Maybe they could help me. I went back inside, the door creaking again as I pushed it open. "Hello," I called out, louder this time. The shuffling sound stopped. I walked to the counter and peered into the back room. It was dark, but I could make out the outline of shelves and boxes. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm out of gas. Is there anyone here?" Still no answer. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I stepped closer to the door, trying to see if there was anyone in the shadows. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but as I got closer, it grew stronger. A sickly, metallic odor that made my stomach turn. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open wider. The back room was a mess, cluttered with broken furniture and piles of junk. In the corner, I saw what looked like a sleeping bag, crumpled and stained. Next to it was a pile of empty cans and food wrappers. Someone had been living here recently. The smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I covered my nose with my sleeve, my eyes scanning the room for the source. And then I saw it, a dark stain on the floor, spreading out from beneath the sleeping bag. My mind struggled to process what I was looking at, but deep down I knew. It was blood, a lot of it. Panic set in. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I needed to get out of here. I turned and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. As I reached the exit, I heard the shuffling sound again, louder this time. It was coming from outside, near my car. I froze, my hand on the door. My car was my only way out, but if someone was out there, I didn't want to think about what that meant. I peeked through the window, trying to see if I could spot anything. The darkness outside was almost complete, but the faint light from the neon sign illuminated the area around my car. That's when I saw the figure. A man standing near the driver's side door, his back to me. He was tall and thin, wearing a tattered jacket and jeans. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at my car. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know if he had seen me, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to think. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't just walk up to my car with him standing there. I looked around the station for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, just empty shelves and broken furniture. The man outside moved, turning slightly as if he was looking around. I ducked down behind the counter, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could hear his footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. He was moving, circling the car. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I needed to get to the car. If I could just make it inside and lock the doors, I might have a chance. I waited, listening to the sound of his footsteps. When they moved to the far side of the car, I made my move. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting towards the car. The man saw me, his head snapping up as I ran. He shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. I yanked the driver's side door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it in one motion. He was on me in seconds, pounding on the window with his fists. His face was contorted with rage, his eyes wild. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, throwing him off balance. He stumbled back, and I took the opportunity to speed away, the tires kicking up gravel as I peeled out of the station. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me go. His figure grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. An hour later, I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and parked near the pumps, my hands still trembling. I told the attendant what had happened, and they called the police. I gave my statement, describing the man and the gas station as best as I could. A few days later, I got a call from the authorities. They had investigated the station but found no sign of the man. The back room was exactly as I had described, bloodstains and all, but there were no bodies, no evidence of who the blood belonged to. They told me the station had been abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era. Whoever the man was, he was long gone. To this day, I don't know what happened at that gas station or who the man was, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he pounded on my window, or the suffocating silence of that desolate stretch of highway. It was a reminder that sometimes, the scariest things in life aren't ghosts or monsters, but the darkness that exists in the hearts of men. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound breaking the stillness as I made my way deeper into the forest. The trail had been quiet for hours with no sign of other hikers. That was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, peace, and the chance to clear my head. Life back in the city had been relentless lately, and this solo camping trip was my escape. My backpack felt heavy, even though I'd packed light: a tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, a knife, and a first aid kit. I'd hiked this trail once before, years ago, but only for a day trip. This time, I planned to spend 2 nights out here. I'd scoured maps and online forums to pick a spot far off the main trail where I'd be unlikely to run into anyone else. By late afternoon, I reached the area I'd marked on my map. The trees here were dense, their tall trunks forming a canopy that let through only scattered shafts of sunlight. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I found a small clearing near a stream, a perfect spot to set up camp. The stream was narrow but flowed steadily, its water crystal clear. It would be my source for drinking water and cooking. I pitched my tent quickly, practiced from years of weekend camping trips. The ground was soft but dry, and I secured the stakes firmly. I gathered some rocks to create a fire pit, then collected dry wood and kindling from the forest floor. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Dinner was simple: a freeze-dried pasta meal rehydrated with boiling water. I ate it by the small fire I'd built, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. As darkness settled in, the forest around me came alive with the sounds of insects and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. I felt a deep sense of calm, the kind that only comes from being far away from the noise and chaos of civilization. After cleaning up and securing my food in a bear-proof bag hung high in a tree, I crawled into my tent. The thin nylon walls felt flimsy against the vastness of the wilderness, but they were enough to keep out the bugs and the chill. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the weight of the day's hike pulling me into sleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes you feel like you're floating in a void. My watch read 2:13 a.m. I lay still, straining to hear something over the pounding of my heart. It was then that I noticed the absence of the usual forest sounds. The insects had gone silent, and even the stream seemed quieter than before. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move through the forest at night, and their presence can cause other creatures to go quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My instincts, honed by years of camping, were telling me to stay alert. Eventually, the sounds of the forest returned, and I managed to drift back to sleep. When I woke again, it was dawn. The air was cold and crisp, and a light mist hung over the ground. I shook off the unease from the night before, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, carrying only a day pack with water, snacks, and my knife. The forest here was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I followed the stream upstream, stopping occasionally to admire the scenery or take a sip of water. About an hour into my hike, I came across something unexpected. It was a shoe, muddy and partially buried in the soft ground near the stream. It looked old, the kind of heavy-duty hiking boot you'd expect an experienced outdoorsman to wear. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The sole was worn, and the laces were frayed. There was no sign of its owner. I looked around, but there was nothing else nearby. No bag, no clothing, no other footprints in the mud. It was strange, but I figured someone might have lost it while crossing the stream or moving through the area. I left the shoe where I found it and continued on. As the day went on, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. I kept feeling like I was being watched, though every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees and shadows. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was already low in the sky. That evening, I built another fire and tried to relax, but my nerves were on edge. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig seemed amplified, my imagination conjuring images of predators or something worse. I reminded myself that I was alone out here, that there was nothing to fear but my own thoughts. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. Instead, I lay awake for hours, my ears tuned to every sound. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start to the sound of something outside my tent. It was faint at first, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart raced as I lay completely still, straining to hear more. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Someone was walking around my campsite. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced with possibilities. Another hiker? A hunter? Someone who had no business being out here? I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then silence. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away. I waited until I was sure they were gone before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow over the clearing. There was no one in sight. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep, keeping my knife close and my ears tuned to every sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop to make breakfast. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest remained empty, the only sounds the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost brought me to tears. I never found out who or what was outside my tent that night. Maybe it was another camper, though the thought of someone wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night without announcing themselves is unsettling. Maybe it was just an animal, though the deliberate footsteps suggested otherwise. Whatever it was, it reminded me of something important. The wilderness is unpredictable. It's beautiful and serene, but it's also indifferent. Out there, you're vulnerable in a way you rarely feel in everyday life. I still love camping, but now I'm more cautious. I double-check my gear, choose campsites closer to established trails, and always trust my instincts. The forest may be peaceful, but it's never entirely safe. I remember the morning I decided to go hiking on a secluded trail. It wasn't a particularly famous route or something that came up in many guides. It was one of those paths hidden deep in the woods, the kind that promises solitude and peace. At least that's what I was hoping for when I started. I had always enjoyed hiking. Being outdoors, away from the hustle of everyday life, gave me a sense of calm that I couldn't quite find anywhere else. The weather was perfect that day. Cool, crisp, with the sun filtering through the canopy of leaves above. The kind of day that made you feel like nothing could go wrong. I packed my backpack the night before, filled it with snacks, water, a first aid kit, and a jacket just in case. I knew better than to head out without the essentials, even for a day hike. The trail was supposed to take a few hours, and I planned to be back before sunset. When I parked my car at the trailhead, there was only one other vehicle in the lot. An old SUV that looked like it had been there a while. No people. The parking lot was quiet, and for a second, I wondered if I should have picked a more popular trail. But I brushed the thought away. I liked the idea of being alone, just me and the woods. I started walking, and the quiet of the forest immediately surrounded me. It was the kind of quiet that presses in on you, the kind where you can hear the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of insects in the trees. The path was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick brush. I couldn't see far ahead, but that only added to the feeling of being deep in nature. For the first hour or so, everything was perfect. The trail was gentle, winding through tall trees and thick ferns. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I breathed in the earthy smell of pine and damp soil. The air felt fresh, cool in the shade of the trees. I took my time, stopping occasionally to drink some water or snap a photo. It was a peaceful kind of quiet, the sort that calms the mind. But as I walked further into the woods, things started to change. The trail became steeper, and the trees seemed to grow denser. The shadows deepened, and the path started to narrow. I could no longer hear the sound of birds or the faint hum of insects. It was almost as if the woods had swallowed up all the usual sounds, leaving only the rustling of leaves and my own footsteps. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just part of the hike, The deeper into the forest you go, the quieter it gets. But after a while, I started to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, a vague feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced behind me and saw nothing but the trail, still winding through the trees. I couldn't even hear my own breathing anymore. It was just too quiet. As I pressed on, the path seemed to twist in odd ways, like it was leading me deeper into the heart of the woods. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and gnarled. I had expected a scenic view or a clearing by this point, but there was nothing. Just more trees, more shadows. I kept looking for signs of other hikers, but there was no one. The air felt thick, and every step I took seemed to echo louder than the last. And then I noticed something strange. The trail markers. I had been following these little wooden signs every so often, the kind that tell you which way to go. But the last one I had seen was a while ago. I stopped for a moment, looking around. The trail had split just ahead of me, but I wasn't sure which direction to go. Both paths looked equally worn. I decided to take the left path, thinking I had passed that way earlier in my hike. The deeper I went, the stranger it felt. There were no more sounds of wildlife, no rustling leaves from animals, no bird songs, just an oppressive silence. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself that it was just my imagination. It was a long trail after all, and it's easy to start feeling isolated when you're alone in the woods. But the farther I went, the more I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. At some point, I stopped to take a break. I pulled out my water and took a long drink, trying to calm my nerves. I sat on a rock for a moment, staring at the path ahead. Something about the way the trees leaned over the trail, their twisted branches reaching out like hands, made my skin crawl. It was like the forest itself was closing in on me, pressing in tighter with every step. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. It was just a remote part of the forest, nothing more. But as I stood up to continue, I noticed something strange. There was a set of footprints on the trail, fresh ones. They weren't mine. I knew they weren't mine because they were bigger, heavier. The prints were deep, as if someone had walked through recently. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there, staring at the footprints. I thought about turning back, retracing my steps, but something told me that wasn't the best idea. The trail behind me looked just as unnerving now. So, I kept walking, hoping to find some sign of life, maybe another hiker or even a trail sign. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The trees seemed to grow even closer together, blocking out the little bit of sunlight that had been shining through earlier. I felt like I was being watched, and it wasn't just the feeling of being alone in the woods. There was something else, something more pressing. My breath was shallow, my pulse quickening. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and there was no sign of the end. And then I heard something, a rustling in the bushes to my left. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something moving, something big, pushing through the underbrush. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the trees. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and my instincts were telling me to leave, to get out of there fast. I quickened my pace, but the feeling of being followed stayed with me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. But it felt wrong. Felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I reached for my phone, but when I checked it, there was no signal. I wasn't surprised. I had known there wouldn't be reception out here, but that didn't help the sense of isolation that was growing stronger. I pressed on, moving faster now, almost running at points, my legs burning from the exertion. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The rustling in the bushes started again, louder this time. I turned sharply, my heart in my throat, but once again, there was nothing. Finally, I saw something up ahead, clearing. It was a small one, just a few trees, but it was a break in the thick woods. I didn't care. I ran toward it, desperate for a moment of open space, something that felt less suffocating. I emerged into the clearing, and for a moment, I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The air here was clearer, the trees fewer. I could see the sky above me again. But even in the clearing, I didn't feel safe. The feeling of being followed hadn't left me. It was still there, hanging in the air. I stood in the center of the clearing, trying to gather myself. I knew I needed to make a decision. I couldn't stay here, and I couldn't keep going forward. I glanced around the clearing one more time, then saw it. A trail marker. A small wooden post, half hidden by the tall grass. I hadn't seen it earlier, and I had passed it without realizing. I walked toward it, scanning the ground for more signs. There was a faded arrow carved into the wood, pointing in the opposite direction. It led back toward the trail I had originally taken. Relief flooded through me. This was the way out. I took a deep breath and turned back, following the marker. The path felt different now, less oppressive. It was still quiet, but it was no longer suffocating. The trees seemed to part just a little, and I could hear the distant sound of wind rustling the leaves. Slowly, the feeling of being followed faded. My breath steadied, and the weight on my chest began to lift. I walked for what felt like hours, but finally, I saw the familiar shape of my car in the distance. The parking lot was still empty, just the old SUV parked where it had been. I didn't care. I was out of the woods. My legs were sore, my feet ached, and I was exhausted, but I was safe. I got into my car, slammed the door behind me, and took one last look at the trailhead. I couldn't explain what had happened out there, but I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had made it out. As I drove away, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I didn't need to look back. I had learned one important thing that day. Some trails are better left unexplored. I can still smell the damp earth and hear the faint crackle of the fire from that night. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend in the woods to escape the noise of the city. I've always found peace in the wilderness, the solitude, the stillness, the humbling vastness of it all. It's something I've sought for years. This trip was no different, or so I thought. I parked my car at the edge of a gravel road that cut through the forest. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. My pack was heavy, loaded with essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a first aid kit. I double-checked everything before heading down the trail. I'd chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from the designated camping areas. The idea was to be alone, away from the hum of RV generators and the chatter of fellow campers. I wanted to immerse myself in nature, to truly disconnect. The hike to the campsite took about 3 hours. The trail was narrow and winding, bordered by towering pines and clusters of ferns. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the occasional scamper of something small and unseen. It was comforting, like nature's own symphony. I felt at ease, my steps light as I navigated the uneven terrain. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a gentle slope leading down to a stream. The water was clear and cold, and I could see small fish darting between the rocks. I set up my tent on a patch of flat ground, taking care to clear away any sticks and stones. The fire pit came next, a simple ring of rocks with dry wood stacked neatly in the center. As the sun began to set, I lit the fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles and a can of beans, and ate in silence, listening to the forest around me. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. A twig snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing, just the normal noises of the forest. By the time the fire burned down to glowing embers, the sky was a blanket of stars. I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap closed behind me. My sleeping bag was warm and comforting, and I drifted off to sleep with the sound of the stream in my ears. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was dark, and the forest was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making you acutely aware of your own breathing. I lay still, straining to hear anything. A rustle, a chirp, a distant howl. Nothing. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves outside my tent. My first thought was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but these steps were heavier, more deliberate. They moved with purpose, circling the tent. My stomach tightened, and I held my breath, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I've always been cautious when camping. I carry bear spray and keep my food stored properly to avoid attracting wildlife. But this didn't feel like an animal. The footsteps paused, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Whoever or whatever it was standing just outside my tent. My mind raced. Should I call out? Pretend I'm not here? I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, gripping it tightly. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the tent. I waited until the sound faded completely before unzipping the flap just enough to peek outside. The fire pit was dark, the clearing illuminated only by moonlight. I couldn't see anyone, but the unease lingered. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had stumbled upon my campsite. Maybe they didn't realize I was here and left when they figured it out. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound made me jump, and I kept the knife within reach. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent, bleary-eyed but relieved to see the sunlight. The forest felt different in the daylight, less intimidating. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints circling my tent. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth, and they definitely weren't mine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who had been out here in the middle of the night, and why had they been circling my tent? I decided to cut the trip short. The thought of spending another night out here made my skin crawl. I hoisted my pack and started back down the trail, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway back to the car, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A piece of red fabric snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a shirt or jacket, torn and weathered. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. My stomach churned as I realized it could belong to the person who had been outside my tent. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. By the time I reached my car, I was out of breath, my shirt soaked with sweat. I threw my pack into the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the gravel road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I finally made it home, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but the experience stayed with me. For weeks, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints or the sound of those deliberate footsteps outside my tent. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that I've never felt truly alone in the woods since. I've always loved hiking alone. Clears my head, gives me space to think. Being out in nature, away from the noise of everyday life, makes me feel like I'm in control. No schedules, no emails, no distractions. Just me and the wilderness. That's why I planned a solo trip to the backcountry trails of the Pacific Northwest. I picked a route that was supposed to take about 3 days to complete. It wasn't particularly well-traveled, which made it perfect. Or at least that's what I thought. The first day was peaceful. I started my hike early, the morning sun barely cutting through the thick mist that hung between the towering evergreens. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. I followed a narrow dirt trail, winding past moss-covered rocks and fallen logs, the sound of birds and distant water filling the silence. My pack was heavy, but I was used to it. I'd packed light, tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and a map. I had no cell service out here, but I had my compass and GPS watch. I wasn't worried. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing next to a slow-moving river. It was an ideal spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat down by the water to eat. As I listened to the gentle current, I felt a strange unease settle over me. Not fear exactly, just something. Maybe it was the quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you'd hear animals moving through the underbrush, insects buzzing, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. But it was dead silent. I shook it off, blaming it on my overactive imagination. I was alone after all. No one was out here. I checked my GPS one last time before bed. Everything looked fine. My camp was about 8 miles from the trailhead, and I planned to cover another 10 miles tomorrow. I zipped up my tent, lay down, and let the exhaustion take over. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. Something had snapped a branch nearby. I held my breath, listening. Then, another sound, this time softer, like the rustling of leaves. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon cast long shadows across the trees. Nothing moved. My heart pounded. Maybe it was just a deer. Still, I sat up for a while, gripping my knife, scanning the darkness until sleep finally took me again. Morning came, and I felt stupid for letting my nerves get to me. I packed up and continued the hike. The trail became rougher, climbing higher into the mountains. The further I went, the more unsettling the forest felt. The silence from the night before never really lifted. I noticed something else too. There were no animal tracks. No deer, no raccoons, not even birds flitting between branches. It was like everything had just left. I pushed the thoughts aside and kept moving. By midday, I reached a ridge with an incredible view of the valley below. I sat on a rock to rest, sipping from my water bottle. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a faint path leading down the ridge, one that wasn't marked on my map. It wasn't an animal trail either. It was too wide, too deliberate. It looked old, overgrown, but still there. My curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was a forgotten shortcut or an old logging road. I decided to follow it. The deeper I went, the more the feeling of unease grew. The trees here were different, older, their bark gnarled and dark. The air was thicker, heavy with the scent of rot. I stepped over tangled roots and ducked under low-hanging branches, my boots crunching on the soft earth. After about a mile, I came across something that made my stomach turn. It was a cabin, or what was left of one. The roof had partially caved in, the wood blackened with age and dampness. The door hung open, barely clinging to its rusted hinges. I should have turned around right then. I should have left, but something about the place held me there, like a weight pressing on my chest. I stepped closer, peering inside. The floor was covered in debris, fallen beams, broken glass, what looked like old animal bones. A rusted bed frame sat against one wall, the mattress long gone. There was a table too, its surface scratched and warped. And then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. a notebook, sitting right in the middle of the table, open, as if someone had just been reading it. I hesitated, then reached for it. The pages were damp, the ink smudged, but I could still make out the words. The entries were short, scattered, descriptions of strange noises, missing supplies, a feeling of being watched. The last entry was barely legible, the words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, it's still out there. It doesn't want me to leave. Asterisk, a sound came from outside. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate. My heart slammed against my ribs. I moved as quietly as I could, setting the notebook down and stepping back toward the door. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't see anything past the tree line, just dense forest. But I felt it. Something was there, watching. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes as I scrambled back up the path, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My pack bounced against my shoulders, the weight slowing me down, but I didn't dare stop. I didn't look back. I just ran until I saw the main trail again, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't stop there either. I kept going, pushing myself forward, fueled by pure adrenaline. By the time I finally reached my campsite from the night before, I could barely breathe. I dropped my pack and collapsed onto the ground, my whole body trembling. I listened. Nothing, just silence. The same eerie silence that had followed me since yesterday. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, staring into the darkness. Every snapped twig, every shift in the wind sent my nerves into overdrive. I didn't know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all. But I knew one thing: I wasn't welcome here. At the first light of dawn, I packed up and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I didn't stop to rest, didn't even eat. I just kept moving, my eyes scanning the trees, my ears straining for any sound of movement. The feeling of being watched never left me. It took me nearly the entire day, but when I finally saw my car through the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and sped down the empty road without looking back. I don't know what was out there. Maybe nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I'll never forget that feeling, that deep, primal fear. And I'll never go back to that trail again. The sun had just begun to dip behind the distant hills as I set out on my hike. I'd been planning this for weeks, picking the perfect trail. It wasn't too popular, but it wasn't entirely isolated either. Just the kind of place to lose yourself in nature without running into a crowd. The morning had been bright, the air fresh, but now, as I strapped my pack tighter and adjusted my boots, a slight chill had settled over the landscape. I glanced around at the woods that seemed so welcoming. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in a layer of damp fallen leaves. I liked that feeling, the quiet rustling of the forest, the fresh smell of earth, and the sound of distant birds. It all felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of daily life. With a deep breath, I began walking. The first hour went by without incident, and I found myself enjoying the solitude. The trees on either side of the path were thick with moss, their trunks gnarled and twisted, like they had stories to tell. I found myself distracted by the forest's beauty, how the sunlight filtered through the canopy in soft rays, making the leaves shimmer. I had forgotten how calming it was to be out here, away from the noise of the city. But then something happened. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. I stopped, leaning closer to examine it. It wasn't much, just a small scrap of dark green material. It looked old, the edges frayed as if it had been there for a while. I pulled my pack a little tighter, suddenly aware of the creeping sensation down my spine. There was nothing to suggest anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone else had been through here recently. I shrugged it off. I was overthinking it. The trail had seen plenty of hikers, and it wasn't as if I was alone. There were other people who had hiked it before me, right? But the further I walked, the less sure I felt. The trail seemed to grow quieter, as though the forest itself had gone still. The wind stopped, the birds stopped chirping. All I could hear now was the crunch of my boots against the ground. It had only been a couple of hours, but the daylight was fading faster than I expected. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the twilight, leaving the path dim and shadowed. I checked my watch. Maybe I should turn back, but the thought of retracing my steps didn't sit well with me. I'd come this far, and I wasn't going to cut it short. The trail began to narrow further, the trees pressing in on both sides. I could see where the path had been washed out in places, with thick roots emerging from the earth like veins in the ground. I tried to step lightly, careful not to trip. The quiet was unsettling now, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint squeak of distant branches. Just as I was about to dismiss the eerie sensation creeping up on me, I saw something ahead. It was a small clearing, just big enough to allow a view of the horizon through the trees. I walked into it cautiously, drawn by the strange pull of the open space. The ground here was covered in soft moss, and the air felt slightly warmer, as though the sun still clung to this spot despite the setting of the day. And then I saw it. A small wooden cabin stood in the distance, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and vines. It was so out of place. No other structures had been mentioned on the map, and I certainly hadn't read about any cabins in the area. I didn't even know if it was abandoned or still in use, but there it was, old and worn, with peeling paint and windows that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. I felt an involuntary shiver crawl up my spine. My first instinct was to turn around, to head back the way I came. Something about that cabin felt wrong, but curiosity won out. Maybe it was just my imagination. I walked closer, every step slow, deliberate, as if I were about to disturb something sacred. The closer I got, the more I noticed details I hadn't seen at first. There were small hand-carved symbols etched into the wood, faint and faded by time, as though they'd been scratched into the surface long ago. A sudden breeze blew through the trees, and I thought I heard something, a whisper. But when I stopped to listen, all I heard was the rustling of leaves. I reached the cabin and peered through one of the dirty windows. The inside was dark, the light barely enough to reveal shadows. It looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. Furniture covered in dust, and what appeared to be a stack of old newspapers lying in a corner. I considered going inside. Maybe I'd find something interesting, maybe just a strange relic of someone's past. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. I stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin, unsure of what to do next. The sinking sun cast long shadows across the ground, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. I looked around, and for the first time I realized how quiet the world had become. The forest was holding its breath. A crackling noise broke the silence, sharp and sudden. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. It was only the wind moving a branch, or perhaps some small animal scurrying in the underbrush. But in that moment, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into my chest. I decided it was time to go. The last thing I wanted was to be caught in the dark in a place that felt so off. I made my way back along the trail, keeping my pace steady. But as I walked, I couldn't help but feel as though I was being followed. Not by a person, but by something far less tangible. The air seemed heavier now, oppressive even. I quickened my pace, my footsteps becoming louder in the quiet of the forest. The feeling of being watched never left me. The trees seemed closer, the shadows deeper. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. When I finally reached the point where the trail forked, I let out a sigh of relief. The main path was just ahead, and I was close enough to the end that I could see the distant clearing where I had started earlier. The sun was nearly gone now, but there was enough light left to guide me. But then, as I stepped toward the familiar path, something made me stop. Something wasn't right. I looked around, my eyes darting over the trees, and that's when I saw it. The cabin. It was no longer in the distance. It was there right in front of me, just off the trail, hidden by trees. How had it moved? How could it be there now? I stood frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical part of me screamed that it couldn't be real, but the cabin was there, unmistakable in its decrepitude. I could see the faded paint and the carved symbols once again, and the feeling of being watched, it was stronger now. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't move. I stared at the cabin as if it were some sort of puzzle that needed solving, but it only deepened my sense of dread. And then it hit me. I was lost, completely and utterly lost. The trail I had been following was no longer there. The trees had closed in around me in ways they hadn't before, and the path I had walked on so confidently was gone. I had no idea how I had ended up back here at the cabin. My throat tightened, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. My phone had no signal, and I had no way to call for help. The weight of the situation hit me all at once. I had to think clearly. Slowly, I turned around. My only choice was to go back the way I had come. I walked away from the cabin, trying to steady my breathing, but I didn't look back again. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the point where the trail forked again. This time, there was no cabin. There was no lingering presence, no whispers in the trees, just the familiar path that led me back to the clearing. I was shaken but relieved. I had made it out. The hike was over, and I could see the distant parking lot where my car was parked. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, that something in the forest had changed me. I may have been alone, but I knew I would never feel alone again. The woods had a way of creeping into your soul, even when you didn't see it coming. The trail may have been over, but the sense of unease lingered long after I left the forest behind. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. The woods had a way of getting into your mind, and once it did, it never truly let go. I had planned this solo hiking trip for months. I wanted to disconnect from the world for a while, be away from the noise, from the constant distractions of life. The route I picked was deep in the mountains, a trail not many people take, which was exactly why I chose it. I wanted silence, solitude, and nature. The weather was perfect when I started. Cool, crisp air, the scent of pine filling my lungs. I packed everything carefully. Enough food for a few days, plenty of water, a small tent, a knife, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I knew what I was doing. I wasn't a beginner at this. The first few hours were peaceful. The trees stretched endlessly, their branches swaying gently. Birds chirped in the distance. The dirt trail was narrow, winding up the steep incline. My boots crunched against the gravel with every step. I felt good. By afternoon, I was deep in the woods. The sunlight barely broke through the thick canopy above, leaving the forest dim even in daylight. I had expected this. What I didn't expect was the silence. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind had died down. Even my own footsteps seemed muted. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just gotten used to the sounds. But the feeling sat heavy in my gut. Something was off. I kept moving. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trail looked different than I remembered from the map. The trees seemed taller, the shadows longer. I checked my GPS. It showed I was still on the right path, but something about the landscape felt wrong. Then I noticed it. The footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh. The dirt around them was slightly dry, meaning they had been there for at least a day. They were deep, like whoever left them was carrying something heavy. I crouched down and looked closer. The pattern was strange. Whoever made them had been walking in the same direction as me, but then suddenly veered off into the trees. There was no sign of them returning to the path. I stood up, trying to shake off the nervous energy building inside me. Maybe it was just another hiker who went off-trail to explore. But still, why did they leave the path so abruptly? I kept going, keeping my pace steady. The sun was starting to lower, painting the sky orange. I needed to set up camp soon. I found a good spot, a small clearing surrounded by trees, far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed. I set up my tent quickly, ate a small meal, and sat for a while, listening. The forest had gone completely silent again. That night, I woke up to something moving outside my tent. I froze. It wasn't the rustling of a small animal. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath. My mind raced. A bear? A mountain lion? No, it was different. The steps weren't heavy enough for a bear, and they weren't the quick, light steps of an animal. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then silence. I waited, my heart pounding. I didn't hear anything else. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I wasn't sure. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. In the morning, I stepped outside to check the area. The dirt around my tent had been disturbed. Footprints. Human. They circled my tent, then led back into the woods. Someone had been watching me. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I packed my things quickly. I needed to leave. Now, I checked my GPS again. I was still on the right path, but I picked up my pace. The uneasy feeling in my gut had turned into full-blown fear. For hours, I hiked without stopping. My mind kept replaying the night before. Who was out there? Why didn't they do anything? Were they waiting for something? Then I saw it. A backpack. It was lying just off the trail, half buried under leaves. I hesitated, then slowly walked toward it. It looked old, the fabric torn in places, the zippers rusted. I crouched down and unzipped the main compartment. Clothes, a water bottle, a flashlight, a notebook. I picked up the notebook and flipped through it. The handwriting was shaky, frantic. I read a few lines. I hear them at night. They don't leave. They just watch. I tried to leave, but the trail keeps changing. I don't think I'm alone. If someone finds this, get out. Don't stop. Just keep moving. My blood ran cold. I dropped the notebook and stood up. My breathing was too fast. My hands were shaking. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not far. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about the direction. I just needed to get out of there. Branches scratched my arms. Roots caught my feet, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then I saw it. The road. A thin strip of asphalt cutting through the trees. Civilization. I stumbled toward it, my whole body trembling. When I reached the road, I turned back one last time. The trees stood still, the forest silent. But I knew I wasn't alone. I walked until I found a passing car. The driver pulled over, and I climbed in without a word. I never went back to that trail. I never wanted to know who or what had been out there with me, and I never will. I packed my gear carefully, making sure to double-check everything. A few days in the woods alone. That's what I had been looking forward to.
No distractions.
Just me, nature, and some peace and quiet. I'd been feeling overwhelmed lately with work, life, and everything that came with it. A camping trip was supposed to clear my head, to give me that time away. I wasn't expecting anything to go wrong. I drove for hours until the trailhead was in sight, the place I'd picked for my solo camping trip. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly what I wanted. Most people went to the big national parks, but this was smaller, quieter, a patch of forest not marked on every map. When I pulled in, there was no one else around. Not a car in sight, just the trees and the stillness. I set up my tent, hung my food in a tree far away from where I'd sleep, and lit a small fire. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows between the trees, the air crisp. I sat by the fire, the crackle of the wood the only sound. Felt good to be alone, to just sit in the quiet with nothing to do but think. I had no agenda, no worries. That night, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped quickly. The fire kept me warm, though, and I settled into the comfort of my sleeping bag, the sound of the fire still crackling in the background. The forest outside seemed peaceful, a little eerie in its own way, but peaceful. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something, a snap. It was soft, faint, but it was there. My heart skipped a beat. I listened for a second, but the sounds of the forest, crickets, wind in the trees, filled the air again. I shook it off, reminding myself I was alone in the woods. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something smaller like a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't tell what, but it was a feeling in my gut, one that made me pull the sleeping bag tighter around me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was just that sense that something was different, out of place. I finally fell asleep, but not deeply. Every little sound made my eyes snap open. The wind rustling the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crackle of the fire. At one point, I heard what seemed like footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps. They didn't sound like the usual forest noises. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal again, maybe a large one like a bear. But why would it be so deliberate? Why so slow? I sat up in my tent, looking out the small window, but I could only see the outline of trees, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight. The forest was so quiet now, as if it held its breath with me. After a long while, I got up, deciding to check the area. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, careful not to make too much noise. The air was cold, and the wind had died down, leaving everything still. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the ground, expecting to see animal tracks. Instead, the beam caught something odd. In the dirt, just outside the ring of my firelight, were large footprints. They were too big to be a deer, too wide for any bear I'd ever seen. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I traced the outline of the prints in the dirt. There was something off about them, almost human, but not quite. The depth, the size, nothing about them felt normal. I stood up, a knot forming in my stomach. A cold shiver ran through me, and I felt the need to get back to my tent. Fast. I turned, but just as I was about to take a step, a twig snapped behind me. It was too loud to be an animal, too deliberate to be just the wind. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but saw nothing. No movement, no figure, only the dark, towering trees around me. My mind raced. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. I grabbed my gear, my flashlight flicking around in a panic now, and rushed back to my tent. I zipped it up as fast as I could, my heart pounding. Inside, I tried to calm myself. The footprints had spooked me. The sound had spooked me, but I couldn't let fear take over. It was just me out here, and I had to remind myself of that. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every few minutes, I would hear something. A rustling, a snap, a distant thud, and I would snap awake, sitting up in the dark. I checked the food hanging from the tree. It was still there, untouched. Nothing had disturbed it. Maybe I was imagining things. But then, in the distance, I heard something that wasn't in my imagination. A howl. It was distant, but unmistakable. A long, drawn-out cry that echoed through the woods. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a wolf, not the kind of howl I knew. It was something deeper, more guttural. The sound of it crawled up my spine, leaving a trail of dread. I sat in silence, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this forest, that whatever made that noise was getting closer. I laid there, staring at the fabric of the tent, listening intently. But nothing happened for a while. The forest outside remained quiet, and I began to convince myself that it was just an animal, something I had never heard before. Maybe a coyote, maybe some other creature making an unusual sound. Just as I began to relax, I heard it again. This time closer, much closer. The howl was louder now, rising in pitch, a strange, disturbing sound. Sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed my flashlight again, hands shaking, and I turned it on, shining the beam out through the tent. Nothing. The area around me was still. No movement, just trees. The shadows of the night were thick, and the beam of light barely cut through them. I stayed still, breathing shallowly, trying to keep my composure. What if something was out there? Something I hadn't heard before? Something no one had seen? My mind raced with possibilities. I heard the footsteps again, unmistakable, soft but deliberate. This time it was definitely too close for comfort. Too close for comfort. I glanced out the small window of my tent. The beam of my flashlight caught a movement, a shadow. My heart dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, a figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me. I don't know how long I stayed there, my breath caught in my throat, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. Why would someone be out here? There were no trails.
No campgrounds.
Just the deep woods. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, my phone, and without a moment's hesitation, I started packing up. I was done. I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to walk for miles to get to the nearest road. I wasn't staying out here. Just as I was about to zip up my bag, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice, a soft whisper, barely audible, like it was carried by the wind. Leave. It wasn't a human voice, at least not one that sounded normal. It was hollow, cold, and almost metallic. I rushed out of the tent, grabbed my stuff, and without looking back, I started running. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every snap of a twig felt like someone was following me. Every rustle in the bushes felt like it was right behind me. I ran as fast as I could, heart hammering, feet stumbling, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't care about the dark anymore. I didn't care about the fear. I just needed to get out. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless, trembling, and drenched in sweat. I slammed the door shut and locked it, just sitting there for a moment, trying to regain my bearings. I didn't know what I had seen out there or who or what was out there, but I was sure of one thing: I would never go back. The forest was meant to be peaceful, but out there, I learned that sometimes the quiet is just the calm before something else. Something I didn't want to know more about.